Hi, everyone. My name's Joe, and this right here is what we call the Davenport. I'm here on Thursdays where I read a story from the Bible, filter it through my own words and interpretations, and then just kind of chat about what I think the takeaways are. If you have similar goals and interests, I invite you to stick around. As always, seek and you will find. If you're looking for a reason to follow Jesus, you will find it. If you're looking for a reason to not follow, you will find it. So decide what your intention is right now, and let's get started. We are going to move into a 3-week series on Easter, the events leading up to Easter, the crucifixion, resurrection, and the ascension. Because we talk about the disciples so much in this story, I really wanted to do a deep dive into talking about who the disciples were, what their backgrounds are like, and kind of, what their personalities may have been like. I don't know, I can't speak for you, but I know that I've learned more about the Bible than I've in the last 6 months than I've known, really my whole life. And it didn't really occur to me until recently that I couldn't tell you a lot about each individual disciple. I couldn't even name all 12 of them, up until a few months ago. So anyway, that's what we're going to do today. I don't really know how this is going to go, how interesting it's going to be. So I may end up just scrapping the whole thing. But if you're seeing this right now, then obviously it went well. So, all right, a little bit of background on the disciples. In general, all the disciples came from the area of Galilee, which would be present day the northeastern region of present day Israel. There were 12 disciples. 11 of them were from Galilee, and one was from Judea. Now, in general, all the young men at this time went to normal school or primary school until the age of 13, where they learned basic Hebrew teachings, and then they would have, if their parents felt they were exceptionally gifted or dedicated, they would have moved on to be, what's the word? Talmudim, which is Hebrew for student or disciple. They would have become Talmudim, which would have been a disciple of a rabbinical teacher. At the time, rabbinical teachers were generally men around the age of 30 would become, rabbinical teachers that were basically designed to not only do a deep dive for their disciples and their followers into the Word of God, into, the Torah, the Old Testament, the Hebrew teachings, and also help them kind of be aware of their sin or learn how to resist temptation. Or they were viewed as to help protect you from sin and help you be able to get rid of sin in your life. They would have been disciples around the age of 13 up until they were 30. Then they would have became rabbinical teachers on their own and gotten a whole new group of disciples or followers of the age of 13, and the cycle would keep going. So I kind of thought to myself, what was the end goal of that, model? What was the goal here? Remember, they're going off of the Old Testament, the prophecies. They're looking for the Messiah. They're waiting for the Messiah. And I believe the logic here is that the more people that are aware of the Messiah and what to look for, the more likely we'll recognize him, and the more likely, we'll see him. A little bit of irony in that, but we're going to circle back to that later. That is kind of who a rabbinical teacher was at this time. Now, Jesus was a rabbinical teacher, but he wasn't formally ordained. He wasn't formally educated. I mean, take that with a grain of salt. I mean, he was Jesus, but in the views of Jewish law, he wasn't formally ordained or educated. Let's say that. He kind of went about things a different way than traditional rabbinical teachers and other religious leaders. So he really wasn't viewed as, he was really viewed as maybe unorthodox and just a little bit different methods. We also have another rabbinical teacher who was active at this time, John the Baptist, who was Jesus's, John the Baptist and Jesus, we do know, were 6 months apart in age. So very, very close growing up. They probably grew up just next to being twins. Also became a rabbinical teacher, but he specifically told his talmidim or disciples, I'm preparing the way for someone that's coming after me. And I'm going to kind of nudge you to him when he starts his ministry. John the Baptist's goal of being a rabbinical teacher was to prepare people for Jesus, or to prepare his disciples for Jesus, to recognize him, I guess, as the Messiah. I went down a great rabbit hole trying to find out how old they all were. A lot of mixed theories and mixed articles that speak to how old Jesus' disciples were. So all I will say is that the only one we know presumed for sure as being older than 20 is Peter, because in Exodus 30, there is a Jewish law that every male over 20 is required to pay a tax to help maintain the temple, help keep up with the temple, take care of the temple. In Matthew 17:24, Jesus tells Peter to pay the tax for me and you, which implies that Jesus and Peter were both older than 20. But if the other ones weren't paying the tax, it's assumed that they were younger than 20. That's the only verse that could, in my opinion, could possibly speak to how old they were. They were all out of school, so we all know they were older than 13. And the only one that we know for sure that was married was Peter, again, because there's a verse that speaks to him having a mother-in-law. So yeah, other than that, I really didn't get any clear answers as to how old they were when they met Jesus and when they followed Jesus. So that is a big overview of the disciples as a group. Now we'll do a deep dive on each one separately. Matthew 4, verse 18. As he was walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew, casting a net into the sea. They were fishermen. He said to them, "Come after me, and I will make you fishers of men." At once they left their nets and followed him. He walked along from there and saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. He went around all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and curing every disease and illness among the people. His fame spread to all of Syria, and they brought to him all who were sick with various disease and racked with pain, those who were possessed, lunatics, paralytics, and he cured them. And great crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan followed him. All right, so our first disciples are brothers Andrew and Peter. Peter is always listed first, so it's assumed that he's older. He also originally goes by Simon, and then Jesus eventually changes his name to Peter. Both Andrew and Peter were grew up in kind of a fishing background. Their father or their families were probably fishermen. They were also both from the town of Bethsaida, which is a very, very, very small fishing village right on the Sea of Galilee. So obviously fishing was a great trade. That was their economy in this fishing village, and in this whole region was fishing. So Peter, we know for sure, is the only one who is confirmed to be married, like I mentioned. I don't know if impulsive is the right word, but he often speaks the loudest. And the person that speaks the loudest isn't necessarily the one that's always right, but the person that speaks the loudest is often the one that's heard and remembered. He was a fisherman by trade. I don't think that he necessarily, I'll come back to this too, but I don't think he necessarily wanted to be a fisherman by trade. The way I see it is when you get married, you have other priorities. You have other responsibilities, and we know for sure he's the only one that was married. So I could see how he became a fisherman because it's, I'm married and I've got to take care of my family. I've got responsibilities. I've got to earn a living. So this is what I'm going to do. This is what's available for me. Bethsaida was a very, very, very small fishing village, at the time said to be probably less than 500 people and maybe only about a square kilometer in distance. So very, very, very small. We're talking a town where everybody knows everybody. You grow up with everybody. You know all the same people. You probably have all the same people in, all your grades through school. You probably marry someone that you've known since you were a toddler. Your individual circle is the same all through growing up in towns like this. I don't know if you're from a small town or if you know someone from a small town, but small town personalities are just, and I don't know, in my opinion, small town personalities are just a lot more like open to, talking to people you don't know that well, or just smiling at strangers on the street, or just a lot more, I don't know, welcoming, I guess, is how I picture Andrew and Peter to be, with that information. Oh, also, after Jesus was crucified, it said that all the disciples kind of went their separate ways and went to different regions of Israel, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, and Greece, and preach the gospel. And then eventually they're all believed to have been martyred for preaching in various ways, except for John. He's the only disciple that's believed to have died just from natural causes. In John 21:18, Jesus will predict Peter's death by telling him, when you're old, you'll stretch out your hands. Someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. And it's said that Peter was martyred by Emperor Nero around the year 64. He was crucified on a cross, but wanted to be crucified upside down because he felt he was not worthy to be crucified right side up like Jesus. Now his brother Andrew was an original follower of John the Baptist. Somehow, the way I see it is, if you went on to become a disciple of John the Baptist at the time, who again was like maybe more of an unorthodox leader, I believe that John the Baptist wasn't formally ordained either. I need to research that. The way I see it is he probably really had to convince his parents, like, hey, I met this guy and I really want to study under him. And, he's a little bit different, does things a little bit different, but, I really, really, really want to study under him because I really feel like, I'm learning the word of God so much more, when I'm studying with him. And they're like, oh, okay. Who's this guy? Oh, it's John the Baptist. And they're like, oh, okay. We heard about him. He's a little bit different. So I think that, and then you basically went on to go travel, with these rabbinical teachers and basically camp out with them and live with them and stay wherever they're staying and just be with them full time. Andrew was an original follower of John the Baptist. So I don't know if you've ever met someone that's like kind of like maybe in your mid to late teens, early 20s, however old Andrew was, but we know he was all in and we know he was devoted to seeking the word of God, because he was the original follower of John the Baptist. I just have a lot of respect for people that are really, interested in seeking God independently and not really interested in what everyone else is doing. And what's also interesting, I find, is that normally, in siblings, normally the younger sibling wants to be like the older sibling, and the younger sibling wants to do everything the older sibling does and play all the same sports and hang out at all the same places and hang out with all their friends. And, oh, where are you going? Can I come? Like, the younger sibling is usually like that. Here it's kind of flipped around, because Andrew was an original follower of John the Baptist. John the Baptist eventually said, after he baptized Jesus, this is the one I'm preparing the way for, and kind of nudges him towards Jesus. Jesus eventually grabs a hold of Peter and says, hey, Simon Peter grabs a hold of Simon and says, hey, let's go follow. This is Jesus. Let's go follow him. And then that's how Simon Peter gets on board. So the younger sibling kind of recruited the older sibling here, which I think is interesting, because normally it's the other way around in sibling dynamics. Andrew is believed to have been martyred in the Greek city of Patras around the year 60 AD. That was two brothers. Now we have Philip. The next two we're going to talk about is Philip and Bartholomew. I'm going to read John 1:43. The next day he decided to go to Galilee, and he found Philip. And Jesus said to him, follow me. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the town of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and told him, we have found the one about whom Moses wrote in the law, and also the prophets, Jesus, son of Joseph, from Nazareth. But Nathanael said to him, can anything good come from Nazareth? Philip said to him, come and see. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "He is a true Israelite. There is no duplicity in him." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered and said to him, "Before Philip called you, I saw you under the fig tree." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered and said to him, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than this." And he said to him, "Amen, I say to you, you will see the sky opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." So that was the calling of Philip and Nathanael. Philip was, like it mentioned, Philip was also from Bethsaida. So if Philip, Andrew, and Simon are all from Bethsaida, like I said, very small fishing village, they probably all grew up together, knew each other since birth, probably had all the same friends, had all the same hangout places. These three were probably natural buddies in the group of disciples, is what I'm trying to say. He had more of a pessimistic personality, is how it's written. Which I don't know if I want to say pessimistic. He seemed to see the problem more than the possibility of a miracle. Some of the disciples saw a problem as an opportunity for a miracle. Philip often saw a problem as a delay of a miracle. Basically, when in the story of feeding the 5,000. Philip is the one that says there's 5,000 people here. How are we ever going to feed them? You know how much money it's going to cost them to buy 5,000 people lunch? We're going to have to do this and this and this. And look at all, this is just a big mess. This is never going to happen. He's the one that really points out all the reasons why things can't happen. He had a very, very logical mind. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think there's nothing wrong with using logic in your reasoning. I just think that it's also what we learned from Philip is the importance of balancing it with our faith as well. It's believed that after Jesus was crucified, he married later and eventually had 3 daughters. Eventually went on to preach in Hierapolis, which I believe is also in Greece, with Bartholomew and his sister Marianne. All 3 of them were preaching, converted the wife of the proconsul. The proconsul then got mad, ordered that all 3 of them be tortured, and then ordered that Philip and Bartholomew is Nathanael. I'll come to that later. Philip and Bartholomew will be crucified upside down. I don't know what happens to Marianne. Philip continues to preach from the cross upside down. And then Bartholomew is released, but Philip is not. And that's how it's said that he was, that he died. And that was around the year 80 in Hierapolis, which is in present day Turkey. Now, Bartholomew, who also goes by Nathanael, something that comes up a lot in these stories is someone has a name, but they also go by another name, but the 2 names sound nothing alike. I don't understand it. I don't know if you've ever met someone and they're like, "Oh, this is my friend Gary, but we call him Cheese." And you're like, "Okay." Where does that come from? And they're like, "Oh, it's this crazy story back in college. It's a long story. You wouldn't understand it, but back in college he did this crazy thing, and ever since then we call him Cheese." And you just never asked any questions, just went along with it. So that's just what I think of when we're like, this is Nathanael, but he also sometimes goes by Bartholomew. It's like, okay, well, to be fair, I probably would have picked the name Nathanael myself, but anyway, over Bartholomew. Now, Bartholomew. So Philip was also from Bethsaida. Bartholomew was from Cana, which I read would be present day Tel Aviv, Israel. Not 100% sure. Bartholomew and Philip somehow met and somehow became friends. I don't know how, but Bartholomew didn't grow up with the other 3. After Jesus was crucified, he's credited as preaching in Armenia, and as a result, in the year 300, Armenia became the first region to make Christianity its official religion. The ruins of Saint Bartholomew Monastery are in Armenia, at the alleged site where he was martyred. Visitors have not been allowed to visit here due to military and political security. Although in 2014, a project was announced that it would be restored and made open to visitors as a big tourist attraction. But since then, nothing has happened. And that was, 12 years ago. So to my knowledge, you still can't visit it, but it's the alleged site of where he was martyred. And it's believed he was martyred in Armenia in the year 70 by being beheaded or crucified or drowned. Doesn't say for sure. Okay. So now we have Andrew and Simon Peter, the brothers, Philip, their friend from childhood, and Philip's friend, Nathaniel, who also goes by Bartholomew because of this crazy thing that happened back in college, but it's a long story. Okay. Now we have Matthew, who also sometimes goes by Levi. Again, another story that we aren't told. I'm going to read Matthew chapter 9. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the customs post, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. While he was at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat with Jesus and his disciples. The Pharisees saw this and said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" He heard this and said, "Those who are well do not need a physician, but the sick do. Go and learn the meaning of the words, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice.' I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Now, Matthew was likely the most educated because he was a tax collector and likely was fluent in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. Okay, so backstory here. There's a lot of dissent at this time between the Jews and the Romans. The Jews are very, very defiant against the Romans. They don't want to follow any of the Roman laws. They feel like they shouldn't be under Roman leadership. In their mind, a Messiah is going to come and overthrow the Roman government, and it's going to be, this great battle and this great win, and then the Jews are going to take over, this region, and they're no longer ruled by the Romans anymore. Being a tax collector was a Roman government job. What the tax collectors would do is stay at whatever post they're assigned and basically charge a tax at their leisure, just at any import or export that came in. Remember, we're in a very, very, very popular fishing region. And so basically Matthew would charge whatever he felt like not just Matthew, but a tax collector charged whatever he felt like he could get out of people. And then the tax collector would basically take a cut for themselves and keep some, for themselves. So it was a Roman government job. And Matthew was a Jew, and he took this job. And because of that, the Jews resented him. He probably didn't have a lot of friends because nobody wanted to be friends with a tax collector because you viewed them as someone that would just rob you blind. And he definitely didn't have any friends that were Jews because the Jews viewed Matthew as a traitor. They viewed that you went to go work for the Roman government. You just betrayed us. You no longer are our friend. So Matthew probably was a bit of a loner. He also probably joins the group of disciples, and the disciples are probably looking at him like, you just taxed me $5,000 yesterday and stole that from yourself. I want my money back. They're probably right from the jump. They don't like Matthew's not getting along with anyone. There's probably a lot of dissent and arguments. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Jesus would have done that intentionally, to show that Jesus is there to help and teach and preach the gospel and heal and serve everybody, not to exclude any specific group. But as humans, I mean, it's fair to say that anybody would have looked at Matthew and been like, "What's that guy doing here?" That you just made it so that I couldn't feed my family yesterday. Being a tax collector was also a very dangerous job. Somebody could be waiting for you to leave your house and, attack you because as a revenge or because of a tax that you charged on them. So it's believed that Matthew was martyred in Ethiopia by a sword in the year 68. Okay, next one is James, there were two James, and this person was called James the Less. And if you called someone the less in this time in Greek, it meant they were either younger or shorter. So we don't know which or both. He could have been both, but we don't know a lot about him other than people called him James the Less. So he probably laid low. That made me think I would too if that was my nickname. He is believed to have been crucified in Egypt, and I don't know what year. Often overlooked, not quoted a lot in the Gospels. So he was either more soft spoken, didn't speak up a lot, chose to be behind the scenes, or for whatever reason, just wasn't mentioned a lot in the Gospels. He was also from Galilee, and that's all we know about him. Thomas, I think Thomas and Philip. Remember how I talked about the one that had like the pessimistic attitude? I think Thomas and Philip would have been friends because Thomas, he's known as the doubter because when he hears about Jesus rising after the crucifixion, he says, I will not believe it until I see it. Remember in the story of the first sin, if the serpent is going up to Eve and saying, by using your own human sense and logic, this doesn't make sense, so it can't be with that information, Thomas is known as the doubter because he says, I will not see unless I believe. I just thought that was interesting. I think that he and Philip probably would have been good friends. So he had a very logical and also very literal mind. In John 14:5, Thomas asked Jesus, John 14, do not let your hearts be troubled. You have faith in God, have faith also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If there were not, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back again and take you to myself, so that where I am, you also may be. Where I am going, you know the way. Thomas said to him, Master, we do not know where you're going. How can we know the way? And Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So again, it's fair to say that Jesus spoke very metaphorically a lot and figuratively. Thomas took things very literal, I think, in the quotes. And so Thomas is literally saying, well, if we don't know where you're going, how are we going to get there? Can you give us a map? Can I put the address in my phone? How am I going to know which way to go? Like, what's the shortest, are there gas stations along the way? I have to plan my route. Like he was really operating from a sense of going off of your own logic and understanding, which isn't a bad thing. We also just want to pair it with our confidence in God, right? It's believed that Thomas was martyred in India by being stabbed. A specific date is given, which is interesting. He's the only disciple that has a specific death date. July 3rd of the year 72. Not sure. St. Thomas Cathedral in India is built on what's believed to be his tomb. Now, Jude, who also goes by Thaddeus sometimes, again, another story that happened back in college, could have possibly died in the year 65 with Philip or in Lebanon with Simon the Zealot, but we don't know which one. Again, wasn't quoted that often or mentioned that much. All right, now let's talk about James and John. James and John were another set of brothers, and they were sons of Zebedee, who was also a fisherman. And it said that they came from money because their father it said that Zebedee had servants. He had hired hands and like hired employees that worked for him. He probably owned his own fishing business, and he was probably setting up his sons to take over the fishing business. So they likely had a job security here. So scholars believe that James was the first to die in Jerusalem by being martyred in the year 44. So about 11 years after Jesus was crucified. Jesus called James and his brother John sons of thunder because they were believed to have bold personalities. Like I mentioned, they were wealthy. Their father had servants, and their mother Salome was a wealthy woman who was known to support Jesus' ministry. We'll talk about that again later when we talk about women of the New Testament. In the 4th century, Eusebius of Caesarea quoted Clement of Alexandria about James' death. It appears that the guard who brought him into court was so moved when he saw him testify that he confessed that he too was Christian. So they were both taken away together. And on the way, he asked James to forgive him. James thought for a moment. Then he said, I wish you peace, and kissed him. And then both were beheaded at the same time. And that is James' recorded death. John is believed to be the youngest. He was the only one by Jesus' side at the cross, and Jesus gave Mary to John to care for her after he passed away. So he entrusted Mary. Jesus is crucified. John takes care of Mary, his mother, until she dies. I don't know how long that takes. Then he goes to Ephesus, which is a city on the coast of Turkey, where he preaches. The emperor there, which is Emperor Nero, exiles anyone that preaches Christianity to a Greek island known as Patmos. So everyone is shipped over there, basically. So it's like you aren't tortured or crucified or harmed. You're shipped to this Greek, deserted island where you're basically just where you're basically left there. So when I first read that, I was like, that's his punishment. Like he gets sent to a Greek island to go live on a Greek island with people that think the same way he does. I think it's just because now Greek islands are so like glamorous, and that's where everyone vacations. I'm sure at the time it was a punishment of sorts, and I'm sure it wasn't glamorous, and I'm sure that there was suffering, and there wasn't a lot of food or fresh water or water to drink. I'm sure that there was a lot of suffering going on. Just my first instinct was it sounded like quite a glamorous punishment. But anyway, then he was exiled to the Greek island of Patmos, and he was there from anywhere from 18 to 24 months. There, Jesus gave him a vision where he wrote the book of Revelation. We'll talk about that another day. After Emperor Nero passes away, a new emperor, Emperor Domitian, revokes all the laws that the Emperor Nero made. So this new emperor basically says that everyone that's exiled on the Greek island of Patmos can come back. So, this isn't an effective use of our taxpayers' money. Let's ship them all back here. So everyone that had been exiled onto that island comes back to Ephesus. And it's said there that John went on to preach in Ephesus until he passed away from natural causes. Tertullian, a Christian writer from the late 2nd and early 3rd century, wrote that before the Romans banished John, they brought him into a Colosseum and dunked him in a vat of boiling oil. When he emerged unharmed, the entire Colosseum then converted to Christianity. Simon the Zealot. Let's talk about the Zealots here. Okay. The Zealots were a very, very charismatic, bold Jewish nationalist party that, again, there's a lot of dissent between the Jews and the Roman government, and the Zealots believe that the Messiah is coming, but they believe that the Messiah is going to come in aggression, and he's going to overthrow the Roman government, and he's going to, the Roman king and become the new king, and he's going to take away all Roman laws, and there's going to be no more taxes, and the Jews are finally going to be free of oppression, and the Messiah is going to come and save us, but he's going to save us by way of force and violence, is what I'm trying to say. That's what the Zealots were expecting. Simon was a Zealot. He also probably came into the group butting heads with some people. He probably had some views that weren't really as accepted right away. Simon the Zealot was a Canaanite who was also from Galilee, and it's believed he died in the Roman Empire, martyred with Jude in what would be present-day Lebanon. It's believed this happened around the year 65, and it's believed they were cut in half by saws. Simon and Jude were commanded demons to come out of false idols, and then they were killed by religious leaders as punishment. So then I went down kind of like this rabbit hole, and I thought to myself, well, when did the Zealots come about, and when did they disappear? It said that the Zealots they started, as this kind of political uprising group around the year 6, around the time when Roman taxes first started. So basically the Zealots believed we submit to God. Only God can give us laws. The Romans can't give us laws. So we're not going to follow any laws that the Romans give us. No taxes. We're not giving them any money. Remember, Simon the Zealot probably really resented Matthew, the tax collector, because he didn't believe that we should pay any taxes. And we're going to, we're going to totally, we refuse to obey the Roman government, and we're waiting for the Messiah who's going to overthrow the Roman government, and it's going to be this big violent force. That was around the year 6. So really around the same time that Jesus was born. They believed they would only be ruled by God and should not have to follow any government laws or law enforcement. After Jesus was crucified, the Zealots intensified their violent rebellion against the Roman rule, which began the first Jewish-Roman war in the year 66 to 73. This led a revolt that captured Jerusalem, but ultimately lost when the Romans destroyed the city and temple in the year 70. The movement eventually ended and fell apart in the year 73 when all the remaining members committed to avoid capture. Who else was a zealot? Judas. Judas' original calling is the only one not recorded in the Gospels. Believe that he was a treasurer and that he was also embezzling funds. The way I see it, if Judas was a zealot, he was expecting Jesus to come in, and if Jesus is the Messiah, how should I put this? If Jesus is who he says he is, what I'm expecting is that he'll overthrow the Roman government with violence, is what Judas is looking for. When Jesus didn't do that, I think is when Judas started to get those thoughts. I think he had those thoughts in his head before the Pharisees even approached him and offered him money to help them identify Jesus. I think that he already was thinking, or Jesus must not be what I think, because he would look a different way and he would act a different way. And this would all be going a much different way than how it's going. I think that's how he justified his actions, is what I'm trying to say. The enemy will try to get into your head and justify your actions any way possible. You have to be vigilant of your thoughts. The Gospels have two separate accounts of Judas' death. Matthew 27:5 says, Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. Acts 1:18 says, with the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field, and there he fell headlong, and his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. The last disciple, no details on him. After Judas passed away, they chose a replacement for Judas named Matthias, who was also from Judea. Other than that, we don't know anything about him. We don't even know how he died. Interesting that 11 disciples were from Galilee and one was from Judea. And 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament, Judea is the tribe that's said to have rebelled against God and left God, right? Okay, so that was all the disciples, 13, including Matthias. There are two other people I want to talk about that weren't disciples, but I still think it's important to mention, and that's Mark and Luke. Maybe this is common sense, but it never even occurred to me until 6 months ago that Mark and Luke never even met Jesus. You know, they're not mentioned in gospel. So I thought to myself, well, who's this Mark and Luke? You know what, like, where you know, when they come into the picture? Mark and Luke actually never even met Jesus. It's believed anyway that they never met Jesus. No, they both compiled their gospels by interviews with eyewitness testimony, and Mark interviewed Peter a lot. He traveled with Peter after Jesus was crucified, interviewed Peter as well as other witnesses of Jesus' miracles, and that's how he compiled his gospel. Luke traveled with Paul. We'll talk about Paul again later too. We don't know a lot about Mark's death, although it's believed that he was also martyred in Alexandria, Egypt, around the year 68 after being seized by a pagan mob during Easter celebrations, where he was dragged by ropes and horses through the streets until he died from his injuries in the stampede. Based on his age, in theory, he would have been in his teens during Jesus' ministry, so he could have maybe not met Jesus, but he could have definitely seen Jesus' miracles or been around when Jesus had his ministry. There's one verse in the Gospel of Mark that some scholars believe Mark is talking about himself, unnamed. Mark 14:43. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs who had come from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. His betrayer had arranged a signal with him, saying, "The man I shall kiss is the one. Arrest him and lead him away securely." He came and immediately went over to him and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. At this, they laid hands on him and arrested him. One of the bystanders drew his sword, struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his ear. Jesus said to them in reply, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to seize me? Day after day I was with you teaching in the temple area, yet you did not arrest me, but that the scriptures may be fulfilled." And they all left him and fled. Now a young man followed him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth on his body. They seized him, but he left the linen cloth behind and ran off naked. Some scholars believe that the young man mentioned here that ended up getting away naked was Mark. And maybe, to be fair, if I was writing that story about myself, I'd probably be embarrassed and leave myself unnamed too. So maybe that's why Mark isn't claiming his identity in that way. We don't know. However, very well could have been in the crowds following him and could have been around, when Jesus was arrested. And I don't understand how a young man wearing nothing but a linen cloth was, okay, so I guess, teenage boys are just a little bit more likely to take off their clothes at inappropriate times. So maybe that, was going on. I don't understand why a young man was here wearing just a linen cloth, and apparently they tried to get a hold of him by grabbing the linen cloth. Why wouldn't you grab his shoulders or something? And then in the struggle, the cloth came off and he escapes naked, and now he's streaking to get away. And that's, maybe Mark was writing that in his 30s after he had a fully developed frontal lobe and thought to himself, maybe I'll just leave myself unnamed there. Now, talking about the rest of Mark's writing style, his gospel, like I mentioned, is the shortest. It's very fast-paced and urgent. He uses the word immediately 41 times and writes as if the events just happened. And he really puts urgency on Jesus' miracles and authority. So he's really he wrote with a lot of intensity, skipped over Jesus' childhood and Jesus' birth and a lot of the backstory, a lot of the context, didn't include any of that, just really jumped to the core of Jesus' ministry and Jesus' mission. Now, talking about Luke, the more I read about Luke, the more I feel like I really would have enjoyed getting to know him. He's on my list of people that I want to look up where they're living in heaven and, see if I can go buy him a Starbucks or something. He had a background as a physician. So, I think it's fair to say, I think a lot of physicians are more compassionate, especially for the marginalized. Luke's writing will specifically highlight the marginalized. It's the only gospel that names the women that followed Jesus. My name is Joanna, and the name Joanna comes from the Gospel of Luke as one of the women that was at Jesus' tomb when he resurrected. And it's almost as if Luke was doing these interviews with people and saying, he's getting the story down about who was at the tomb, and the person he's interviewing is maybe saying, "Oh, some women were there," and then Luke was saying, "Okay, what women? What were their names?" And then the other gospels say, "A group of women were there." Luke says, "No, I want to know their names. I want to include who they were. I want to highlight the women and the marginalized." Luke is believed to have met Paul in Troas around the year 51 in what would be present-day Turkey. Tradition says he was hung from an olive tree around the age of 84 in Thebes, Greece. Matthew's writing style was very systematic, organized, and highlighted prophecies that pointed to Jesus being the Messiah. So Matthew is very, here's the prophecy, here's Jesus fulfilling it. Here's the prophecy, here's Jesus fulfilling it. It's almost as if that was Matthew's main goal, was to point to Jesus being the Messiah. John's writing style was much more emotional, poetic, and very symbolic. He really spoke to strong contrasts, highlighting light versus dark and truth versus lies. He specifically pointed to having a very personal relationship with Jesus and intimacy with Jesus. He spoke a lot to being by Jesus' side, sat next to Jesus at the Last Supper, was the only one at the cross when Jesus was crucified, was the one that Jesus entrusted, to take care of Jesus' mother. He really, really highlights having a personal relationship with Christ. And I want to lean into this verse because, remember, I think the most popular verse, arguably the most used verse in the world, is John 3:16. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son so that everyone believing in him would not perish but have eternal life. You have that verse memorized, don't you? The word translated to believe in Greek is pisteuion. I think I'm saying that right. Pisteuion does not mean agree as facts. It does not mean believe in the sense that we are in agreement of something is true. It means to commit oneself to structure one's life around, to devote oneself to entrust one's life with. That's what that verse is saying. That gives it more weight. It's not saying whoever is in agreement that Jesus existed. It's not saying whoever believes that Jesus is the Son of God. You know who else believes in Jesus? Satan. You know who else believes that Jesus is Messiah? The demons. Pisteuon is the word, okay, in Greek. It means entrust oneself to. The person that wrote this verse is John, the one that really wanted to highlight having a personal relationship with Jesus, the one that was by Jesus' side and next to Jesus through everything, at the cross with Jesus, devoted to Jesus, saying, I won't leave you. No matter what happens, I'm not leaving your side. Take with it what you will, but the Greek word in this verse is pisteuon, which means entrusts oneself with, devotes oneself to, structures one's thoughts, words, and actions around this belief. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son so that everyone who entrusts himself in him, everyone who entrusts themselves with him would not perish but have eternal life. For God so loved the world, he gave his only son so that everyone commits themselves to him would not perish but have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son so that everyone who structures their thoughts and words around his mission should not perish but have eternal life. John, who wrote the Gospel of John, the disciple who wrote that verse, had weight behind it, had weight behind that word. Believe isn't just on a tattoo or on a t-shirt or on a coffee mug, right? It isn't just a verse in someone's Instagram bio. It's how we're structuring our life. It's how we're waking up every day and choosing relationship and choosing commitment and choosing and trusting ourselves with Jesus and his mission as the Messiah. And I hope that gives it some weight. I hope that gives it some purpose in your life, because it definitely gives it in mine. I think that's all that I had. That took a lot longer than I thought it would. So I really hope that you found something compelling about this, or at least entertaining. I'm here to absolutely be taught as well as teach. So if I got something wrong, pronounced something wrong, said something wrong, please let me know. I would really appreciate being corrected. Thank you.